So yeah, I just realized that I was coming up to the month when I'd been here for 60 years, when I just arrived in America, sort of not knowing much about America, not expecting to stay or anything like that. So I thought, well, I just give you a little bit of. A lot of people say to me, well, how come you're here? Why do you leave? So the answer is there's a whole series of odd circumstances, which, as you know, can change the direction of your life. So anyway, I was born in the north of England, in an industrial area. The schools during World War II, schools were not that great over there, and in that part of the country. So my parents paid for me to go to private school, which I really enjoyed tremendously in the South. My father was a huge Boy Scout fan, believe it and all that, and so he sent me to the school that produced Baden Powell, who founded the Boy Scouts. He thought it was good for him, it was good for me, and it was. I really loved being in that school. So I did all my academics. I spent most of the time looking out the window, wishing I was outside rather than inside where I was. So, I mean, I did my academics, but it wasn't my first choice. So I became a Queen Scout, Eagle Scout, and I loved the whole scouting thing. But then around the same time, one day Prince Philip came for lunch in our house because he was looking for a place to put Prince Charles to send him to school. I think if he sent him to our school, he'd been a lot happier than where he went, which is in Gordonston in Scotland, where he was absolutely miserable, poor guy. Anyway, but then around that time, everyone was wondering what would Prince Philip really do with his life, because he couldn't get involved in politics. Every time he opened his mouth about something, people got upset about it. So he came up with this idea of a youth program, so that if people did public service and did camping and did all kinds of things, and so a little bit like scouting and so on, then they could receive an award from Prince Philip. It's called the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, and it's now thriving and so on in different parts of the world. But anyway, it was right around the time that he came up with that. And I thought, well, that sounds good. If I can do scouting, I can do that. So I did that, and I was one of the first 6 guys to get this award. So I went to Buckingham Palace and got to know Prince Philip a little bit, because there weren't very many of us, so we chatted about it. And so anyway, so then when I left school, my father was a CPA, and I thought, well, he's very popular, he's really good at what he does, so I'll become a CPA too. Turns out I really am totally unsuited for it, couldn't stand it. But I went and became apprentice, as is the way in England that you do it. You don't actually go to a university for accounting. So I went to, I was an article clerk in a big accounting firm, which is now part of Ernst & Young, in London. So I was delighted to get a bowler hat and an umbrella, and I would commute, and that was, my life. And the people I worked with were just the coolest bunch of guys. I gotta say, it was all guys in those days. But anyway, we did auditing and so on. I hated the auditing. I loved the guys. I loved the fact that a pint of beer was only a shilling, and we had a really a rip-roaring good time. But to sort of make my life more interesting, when I wasn't having to do this sort of during the day, I did 2 things. One, I got in touch with the Duke of Edinburgh's Award program, and so I would go around and do talks to youth groups and tell them about it and get them excited. Then there'd be people who were signing up, and they say, "Oh, we're going to do it." So I really enjoyed doing that. And the other thing was I joined a regiment, which in the city of London is only 1 square mile. It's the old Roman city, and it has the original walls around it and so on. And there's a regiment there which was the original regiment which guarded the city of London. It's called the Honourable Artillery Company, the oldest regiment of the British Army. And you just join, because it's a volunteer army, and it's reserves. It's like our reserves here. So 1 week, 1 night a week, 1 weekend a month, and then 2 weeks a year, we were in training and so on. And I really loved it. I don't mind military stuff at all, as long as you've got reasonable people that you're dealing with and reasonable officers and so on. So it was really terrific, especially when we went away for camp for 2 weeks and we're firing off the kind of guns which actually you see in Ukraine now, firing and all the rest of it. So the 25-pounder shells, you'd pick up a box of 4 shells, 100 pounds, put them in a gun and shoot them off, and we would compete with each other. So anyway, and we were fired off the gun salutes at the Tower of London. So if the Royal Yacht Britannia came back, we were down there firing off the gun salutes to salute the monarch. So anyway, but after 3 years of that, I really said I just can't stand this accounting thing anymore. So my sister was out in, she was living out in Barbados at that time. She'd gone out to visit a friend of hers in Trinidad. And so she said, why don't you come out and all the rest of it? So I thought, okay, good, that'd be fun. I kind of like to go to Barbados. I really didn't have a job or anything like that. But anyway, then when Philip heard that I mentioned in one of the things to the guy who ran the Duke Williams Award, it was someone called John Hunt, who led the first expedition to the top of Mount Everest in 1953. And one of the other people on that Everest was one of my teachers at school, who I really, really respected, because he'd been right on the first expedition. And so actually I did do quite a lot of mountaineering with him in the Swiss Alps and the Austrian Alps with the pickaxe, and ice and all the kind of stuff that Sherman Bull does, because those are, Sherman Bull. But anyway, so I mentioned to John Hunt that I was thinking of going out to the Caribbean. He said, great. He said, we really want to get the word out about the Duke Williams Award program to the British sort of places around the world, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or whatever. He said, so would you go and basically explain it to them, and then you can, sort of launch it. So I said, yeah, that sounds good. I actually got a job to do to go to a place like Barbados. I mean, that sounds pretty good. So I went on a freight ship, so that it was sort of cheaper. And I went on a German banana boat, which was going across the Atlantic. Just two of us were passengers, myself and a vet, a young guy who just graduated from that. He was going to be the equivalent of the ASPCA vet in Barbados, And so the two of us were these two passengers. We went out there. We got to Barbados, and so he had this huge house, a cook, gardener, and all the rest of it, and so on. He said, I've been rattling around this house all myself, so why don't you live here too? So I lived there. And then I wasn't earning any money, and then one day it was right by the harbor, and then this really beautiful sailing boat came in, and so I swam out to the sailing boat and started talking to the guy who was on the sailing boat, And he said, oh, why don't you come up? So I got up there with him. I said, well, he said, well, I'm sailing around the world all by myself. And he said, so I could use some money while I'm here. So we set up a thing where I did flyers, and I went around all the hotels and said, we can take you out sailing and so on. So then we would actually get people together, take them out sailing, and I'd serve the things and hoist the sails, and he'd steer the ship, and so anyway, you earn money any way you can. That's what goes on. So then when I was in Barbados, my sister's friend in Trinidad said, well, why don't you come visit us, seeing you're in Trinidad? It's also the time for Carnival, which is a big deal in Trinidad and Rio de Janeiro and New Orleans. So I went there to Trinidad, which is a really interesting place, with its huge asphalt lake, which actually has a lake of asphalt. They go and dig it up. But anyway, in Carnival, I was sort of there, and the bands were all playing, all these steel bands and everything. And so then suddenly somebody just got upset with somebody, two of the leaders, somebody started shooting, and I'm out in the street there, and the streets are packed with people, And I thought, people they're starting falling down, people would, it was dangerous. So I got into this little doorway, backed into a doorway. I thought, well, I'm at least protected on, three sides. And then I found myself squished in there with about 3 or 4 other people. Well, it turns out they were from Venezuela. So by the time you've been squashed in the doorway tight enough with people, you say, you kind of get to know them quite well. So they said, well, let's go to the Hilton Hotel and have a drink. We're staying at the hotel. So I said, well, I'm coming with you. So I went there, and they said, why don't you come to Caracas and visit us in Venezuela? So I said, well, why not? So I flew over to Caracas.
Hey, Pete, how old are you?
I'm 22 at this point. Yeah. And so I flew over to Caracas, and I had a wonderful time in Venezuela. I met an architect there who showed me all around. Caracas was a phenomenal city, utterly safe, couldn't have been nicer, pleasanter place back in those days. So this is 1965. And but I got all around Caracas, and then this architect said, I've got a friend who's a university professor, and you've got to get out of town and see some other Venezuela. This university was all the way up in Merida, which is up in the Andes, almost in Colombia. So he said, you got to go see him. So I jumped on a bus and traveled through the night and turned up at this guy. He didn't know who I was, but he was really nice. And he was a geography professor, and he told me all about the Andes and all about the geology and everything. And gave me a Chinese meal, which I remember was been the first time I'd ever had a Chinese meal anywhere in the world. But anyway, and then after that I went on the highest cable railway in the world is there, which is built by the Germans and not by the Venezuelans, so it really works. And I went all the way up into way above the snow line in the first thing in the morning, and then that day I went from above the snow line all the way down by bus, all the way down to Lake Maracaibo, which is practically on the equator, down at sea level. And I remember noticing going through all these zones of vegetation. Suddenly there was snow and nothing. And then next thing there's trees, and then there's this and this, and then the next thing you're down, practically in the jungle. So I visited some friends in Maracaibo, and Maracaibo was a big oil city because Lake Maracaibo is a big oil bit. And when I was living in Barbados, I had been on one of the rafts that are off one of the resorts, and two really beautiful girls were there, and they were Dutch, and they said, "Oh, we live in Maracaibo. If ever you come to Maracaibo, you gotta come see something." Okay, so I turned up, and their parents said, like, "Who is this guy?" And I said, "Well, you got two beautiful daughters," and they said, "Come to visit." So they put me up for the night. And then I traveled along the shore of Venezuela all the way back to Caracas. And then I flew back to Barbados. No, I went by boat back to Barbados. I went to some of the other islands to start the Duke Edwards Award scheme there. And when you're going from the Queen's husband, they don't actually put out a red carpet, but they treat you as though they put out a red carpet. I mean, you go to the governor. You don't go to anybody below the governor when you're coming from the Queen's husband. So we set up the program in several different islands. And by that time, I'd met a guy in Barbados who was the American diplomat for Barbados. He was a consul, head of the consul. He wasn't an ambassador because it wasn't an independent country. But anyway, so he said, "Look, I got this house." And we were about the same age, and he said, "I'm riding around here too." And he had a cook, and he had a gardener. So I love this. Everyone has a cook and a gardener, So I moved in with him, And but somehow, and I don't know quite how, because I never really had any money, but somehow I managed to get hold of an old 1938 MG sports car, really nice. And so one day I get back to the house, and our cook says, "Oh, Mr. Simpson, the police are looking for you, the police are looking for you." So I thought, well, what's going on? They said, "They want you to report to the police station." So, I'm going to report to the police station. And the chief of police is there, and the chief of police says to me, he wanted to see me, the chief of police wanted to see me. He said, "The light on your back lumbar plate, the light is out on one side, but if you're ever thinking of leaving the island and want to sell your car, would you call me first?" He had me arrested so that he could tell me he wanted to buy my car. But anyway, but also when I had let my driver's license lapse in England, so I had to do my driver's test in Barbados. So I go to the police station in Barbados, and the driver said, and this big guy comes out in a beautiful white uniform, big black face, white uniform, and comes out and so on. And then he said, "Okay, what are we doing?" And I said, "Over here." He said, "It's your car. It's your car." I said, "Yeah, it's my car." So I thought we'd go out and do left turn, right turn, put the hand signals and so on. No bit of it. He got in the passenger seat, and he said, "We're going here." We toured the entire island. Every village we came to, he had his hand on the horn. He was waving. Then I said, "Have I passed my test?" He said, "Indeed you have." So anyway, so I was living with this guy, Bill Garland, who was, State Department guy. And back in those days, Barbados there was American Navy place up on the North Point. So we would go up there, and we would be able to get all this American stuff, which was fantastic, and take it back and so on, because he was a diplomat. But anyway, he said, "Well, look, before you go back to England," seeing that my sister was going back, and he said, "Why don't you go visit my parents there in Baltimore?" And so I said, "Well, sure." And I had a friend in Washington, one of my old scoutmasters, and I had a friend in New York. So back in those days, so now we're 60 years ago, back in those days, you could buy a 99-day ticket on Greyhound bus for $99, as long as you bought it outside the country. So I bought one of these tickets. So I flew and landed in Puerto Rico and went through customs in Puerto Rico, and I thought, well, I'm not in America. What am I doing going through, immigration, everything in Puerto Rico? What did I know? So anyway, I went to Puerto Rico, but then I got to Miami, and it was really late at night, and so I wanted to get on the bus to go to up to Baltimore. So I got on the bus, so I went to the back of the bus. It was totally empty. I went to the back, and I was lay down on the back of the bus and just went to sleep when it was like midnight, So I woke up something like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and I look out the bus, and the back half of the bus is black and the front half of the bus is white. And everybody is looking back at me on the back seat.
Oh, wow.
And this was probably a month or two before Rosa Parks decided to change the history and so on. So anyway, so eventually I sort of felt uncomfortable and sort of moved forward. But anyway, I got to, went to Washington, visited my good friend, who was a nuclear scientist actually, on loan from Britain to the US. And then I got to New York, and I had this old school friend from New York, from England, and I hadn't thought to sort of call ahead, and he'd gone back. So I got to New York, and it was, I didn't know anybody. But the girlfriend of the Foreign Service guy in Barbados, she had given me a couple of names in America, and one was, both were in New York, but being foreign, I had no idea that New York was a state. I thought New York was a city. So one was from New Rochelle, New York, and one was Buffalo. So I kept dialing Buffalo, and they said, you got to put all this money. I said, no, wrong number, and dial it again, put in, like all this money. So I called New Rochelle, and luckily I got some guy who was a very nice fellow, and he was a Harvard student, and he and some others were doing some work for some company or other. I joined mid-summer thing. So he called up and he said, God, where are you staying? I said, well, this hotel at Port Authority was probably about the seediest hotel around Port Authority that you could possibly be in. And so he said, well, you got to come over where I am, and so on. So he gave me the address, and it turned out to be Sutton Place, So I went over to Sutton Place. I landed in Sutton Place, and I thought, this is, I can get used to this. So I met some really nice people from them, and so I was really sort of, could have been sort of shipped home if I hadn't got my immigration papers. And so I checked in with the counsel for the corporation and said, how are we getting on with immigration papers? He said, oh yeah, he said, we heard back from Albany. And they turned them down because they said, if you're as good as they say you are, they're not paying you enough. So I said, what do you mean? I said, look, just pay me that for 1 week, and then we can show them that, and I'll pay it back to you, but don't rock the boat. And he said to me, I always remember, he said to me, you don't understand. We don't let the government tell us what to do. We tell the government what to do. So we wrote back to them and said, you don't know what you're talking about. And so they said, oh yeah, okay, right. So then they approved my immigration. So anyway, but I worked at General Insurance for, almost, I underwrote their marine insurance. So they flew me around the country, in those days, first class and all that kind of stuff. And, but I didn't like that money thing any more than I really liked doing what I've been doing before. So finally, I met somebody who told me about the Johnson O'Connor Research Foundation in New York, where they do aptitude testing, and they test all your different abilities with tweezers, with all kinds of things. They can spot dentists, they can spot lawyers, they can spot everybody. They know what skill set you have for different things. So they said to me, you've been doing a very, very good job at things that you've been totally unsuited for your whole life so far. They said you should be doing something which is three-dimensional design. You should have architecture, engineering, industrial design, if you don't need any money, sculpture, you can do any landscape architecture, whatever. And so with that, I had the total and then I heard about the landscape architecture profession, and that someone was telling me, this matches all of your other interests and so on. And so when I heard about that, then I went to a conference of landscape architects in Bear Mountain, And there was a Hungarian professor there, and I didn't have a degree, by the way. I didn't have a university degree at this point. I sit next to a guy, the Hungarian professor, and it so happened that in 1956, when the Hungarian Revolution came, he had escaped out of Hungary. But we had taken in a Hungarian family because my father had some friends who were from Hungary. But we'd taken these people in. And when I told this fellow, Julius Favors, about this and the fact we took them in, he said, "You're coming to my department at the University of Massachusetts, and also you're going to become a teaching assistant for me." So I went to UMass. He got me every scholarship that I could possibly line up for me. I was his teaching assistant. And then finally, when I became president of Connecticut Landscape Architects and was trustee, the trustees got to decide who got the highest medal that you give for the society gives to anybody, and so I nominated him, and so I had the pleasure of presenting it to him, along with the president of ASA. But anyway, so then I was at UMass for 2 years, and then finally, when I was coming out of UMass, I got a job with Peter Rowland office, which is the designers of the original master plan for Waveney. So I was going down to Rye, New York, but the first job that I did for them was to go to Waveney and check up on something for Waveney. Wow. And then that was really where I sort of started doing landscape architecture, and then after about 6 years, the firm that I was working with in New Canaan Landscape, they moved out of town, and I just stayed, and so I'm still here. I'm embarrassed to say.
Yeah, when did you meet your wife?
Oh, well, Deborah was I'm going to go back. But Deborah and I met because friends of ours said, you guys got to meet. But Deborah lost her first husband many years ago, and she brought up 3 wonderful little girls. And I have 2 adopted girls from Stanford, not having had any, I have no natural children. And but I had 2 adopted girls. They came when they were 2 and 4 years old, sisters. And Deborah has 3 girls, and so we're lucky to have 8 grandchildren.
Wow.
So I guess the motto of the story is plan ahead your whole life in great detail.
Yeah, right.
Throw the plan out, and if you get an offer, take it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.